Well, we finally did it.
You fooled me. You tricked me. It's a trap.
It's a trap. That was a pretty good trap, I thought. So it looks like we achieved a new record on our subreddit there with the comments from last time's episode.
Of 0.
A fantastic record, a different kind of record of 0.
I think we've successfully hit 0 many times in the past.
Oh, did we? Oh, okay. Clearly it was because of the whole issue of, analog versus digital and vinyl versus CD and all of that. People were just...
It's actually everyone is sending in their comments by handwritten letter.
Right.
With their new fountain pens that they bought after the previous one, and they just haven't come in yet. That's
right, I see.
They've just posted them to Reddit, and they're hoping somebody on staff will, copy it out for them.
Yeah, they're too busy, sort of listening to their Bartok on the wax cylinder to look up and go to the post box and get the deliveries.
Oh, well. How was Helsinki?
Yes, so last week I spent a day in Helsinki. It's a very interesting place. It's a curious place, Helsinki. Have you ever been there before?
No, I haven't.
I think that one thing that kind of surprised me is that it's interesting how familiarity works. Here in Sweden, everything is very foreign to me. I've only been here for 5 months or so, and so everything's still very strange and foreign. Yet when you go somewhere that's kind of similar but not the same, and you suddenly have something to compare Sweden to, it's a very interesting feeling coming back to Sweden. It just sort of feels like, here we are, I'm back here, everything's comfortable and fine, and I understand everything, it's all familiar now, even though it's just really, really foreign. So Helsinki itself, it's a curious place because the history of Helsinki, of course, the history of Finland, Sweden's involvement with Finland, I'm not going to try and talk about the history of Finland because I'm not that familiar with it, but I think about, maybe 700 years? 600 or 700 years? Finland, of course, was part of Sweden. And the cultural and linguistic influence can really be felt when you're in Helsinki because all of the signage is in Finnish and Swedish.
Oh, right. Okay.
And sometimes English.
Right.
So it was very peculiar because coming from I have some basic knowledge of Swedish, going to Finland, when all the signs are in Finnish and Swedish, it's a little bit of it's kind of surreal. Where am I? This place looks different. The people look different. They definitely sound different, the language that they're speaking, and yet there's Swedish language everywhere. And it doesn't end at signage either. One thing that I noticed walking around the city of Helsinki, so basically I had a meeting in the afternoon, then I had an evening flight to catch. So I had the whole afternoon, about 4 or 5 hours, just walking around Helsinki area. And there were maybe 3 or 4 shops that I passed that were actually branded something Stockholm. Like, when you have for example, like a fashion brand will have something, and then Paris or Tokyo or, London or something like that.
Right.
There were 3 or 4 shops that I passed that had some fashion brand or something, and then Stockholm written underneath. Well, that's curious. I mean, so the seeing Finnish and Swedish next to each other so frequently, you really become aware of how different the two languages are.
Yeah.
And they are because they're completely from different branches.
Right.
Swedish is from like the North Germanic kind of branch together with Norwegian and Danish.
Right.
And those 3 languages consequently are fairly similar.
And it's a similar branch from which English derives as well. So even though they look quite different to English, there's a lot that they've got in common.
That's right. And yet Finnish comes from, I actually just did a little bit of research before the show, it actually comes from a branch of languages called the Finnic branch. And there are a number of languages in the Finnic branch of languages, and the 2 major ones are obviously Finnish and Estonian. And there's geography just across the Baltic Sea from Finland is obviously Estonia.
Not the Scandinavian Sea.
Yes.
The Baltic Sea.
Yes. Yeah, that was many geographic failures last episode.
Let's just leave geography aside.
Let's. Anyway, so Estonia being the most similar language to Finnish, and they actually do sound very similar. Yet when you see Finnish and Swedish together so often like that, you're really aware that they're so different. And so I understand, that there is the history of the two countries, and I did a little bit of reading just now on Wikipedia, and I encourage anybody who's interested to go and actually have a read through the history of Finland and Sweden's involvement in Finland, because it is very, very fascinating. But when you're there, you sort of you find yourself wondering why does this country need Swedish anymore? Because it's they are. I believe that in schools, Finnish children are still taught Swedish, and there's Swedish all over the city on signage and branding and all of that. Yet they're so different, the languages, and I think just last year, actually, I believe Finland celebrated its 100th year of independence.
Oh, right.
Which is wonderful and fantastic. You sort of, when you're there, I guess to summarize, I was expecting it to be more different and more Finnish. And yet all of the influences and the historical remnants of the era that, Sweden and Finland were so closely involved together are still so obvious and so on the surface when you're there that it was a little bit surreal somehow. So, yeah, I enjoyed my time there very much, and the food was nice, and the people that I interacted with in shops and this and that were nice, and it was a very cold day, and I ended up down on the coastline looking out over the frozen Estonian Sea. Somewhere in the fog there would have been Estonia on the other side of the water.
Is that as distinct from the Baltic Sea, or are we still are we calling the Baltic Sea whatever we feel like at the time at this point?
Let's just call it the Alex Sea, shall we?
Any sea that Alex sees is the Alex Sea.
Yeah, that'll do. I mean,
say that 10 times fast.
Yeah, we've committed geographic sacrilege so many times already that we may as well just follow through with it all. Anyway,
the Finnish thing is really interesting, though. I don't know an awful lot about it either, but the Uralic family of languages, which I think Finnic or Finno-Uralic or Uralo-Philic or something like that, is a sub-branch of the Uralic or Uralian family of languages, which is mostly spoken by people up in that neck of the woods, Finland and Estonia. But also Hungarian is a Uralic language. And it's like weirdly detached from everything else. I mean, if you look at a map of where the languages that derive off the Uralic family of languages are spoken, it's all sort of way in the north in sort of Finland and also parts of Sweden and Norway, and then further to the east in sort of parts of northern Russia and Siberia and places. Actually, Siberia may be wrong, but then like just randomly, way south of that in Hungary, there's Hungarian. And I think, I'm not totally sure about this, but I think that Uralic might be an entirely separate family that doesn't derive off Proto-Indo-European even. So, have you heard of Proto-Indo-European?
I know Indo-European languages. That's basically all of the sort of core languages of Western and Northern Europe, correct? But I'm not sure about Proto-Indo-European.
Right. Proto-Indo-European is this, imagined is the wrong word, but let's call it a sort of theoretical language that we have no sort of remaining evidence of people having spoken, but it's sort of been reverse engineered by looking at the changes in language in all these different branches, trying to work backwards to a common root.
Oh, wow.
And so they imagine that this Proto-Indo-European language is the common root from which a lot of these other languages derived, and from which, via ancient Greek to something else, via ancient Greek to Latin to French to sort of, well, you end up with English by a few branches because it's got so many influences. But Sanskrit is also derived off Proto-Indo-European, right? The Indo is for the Indian region.
Right.
So from Sanskrit, basically all of the Indian languages derives. But it's this amazing sort of family tree of languages that covers most of India and Western Europe. But I don't think it includes Finnish or Hungarian or Estonian or any of the other Uralic languages, because I think that's actually an entirely distinct tree. And that's amazing when you think of sort of what a spread of languages are related in this way that cover so much ground all the way across the entire of Europe and into India. And yet these small regions have this completely different and unrelated family of languages. So the whole thing is extremely interesting.
Yeah, language and the history of language and language development is just endlessly fascinating. I mean, it's amazing, wonderful kind of phenomenon of human communication and human development, I suppose. The way that, we're all essentially saying the same things, but just in different order, using different words and different sounds and different pronunciation and intonation.
And the extent to which that actually affects our thought. I mean, we think of language as a way to express thought, but thought doesn't exist independently of language. Language informs thought and gives us a structure with which to frame ideas. And if we don't have the language with which to do that, it's actually very difficult to comprehend the idea at all. So there's this very tight connection between language itself and understanding and the things that you're capable of understanding.
Yeah, you definitely get a sense of that with children, because with our children, it's interesting that you can see when something has been labelled with a way to say it in a language, it becomes that much easier to interpret and deal with and process. For example, when a child is experiencing a kind of unusual emotion for the first time, for example, nervousness, that if as a child grows up, eventually something like nervousness or jealousy or, these kind of more complicated emotions, they start to happen from time to time, but the child doesn't sort of know what's going on. I just feel really strange and unsettled, but I don't really know why. And it's when you're raising a child, it's really, really helpful to be able to give them a label for how they're feeling or what's going on, or an object or, an adjective or whatever, or a verb to actually describe something, because then it's like that, this amorphous abstract concept of, for example, nervousness, where they're feeling something. As soon as they have a label for it, then there's boundaries drawn. Oh, this is nervousness, which means that they can recognize it again and then call it out. I am feeling nervous.
Right.
And, it is almost like without that label, just as you said just now, it's like without that label and without that descriptor, it's like this very strange, kind of hazy thing that's happening to you,
right?
Which you can't really get a grasp of. So, as you said, the thoughts and language are so closely wound up together. I was just thinking just now, when we're talking about Scandinavian languages there with Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, some of my Swedish friends have told me that in companies where they work together with Norwegians and Danish people, I'm always curious to ask, well, what language do you speak in that situation? Do you speak Norwegian to them, or do they speak Swedish to you, or how does it work?
Right.
And the people that I've asked tend to say the same thing. They say, no, when we work with Norwegians, the Norwegians just speak Norwegian and we just speak Swedish. And they just sort of understand each other. And the Danish sort of stretches out a little bit, slightly different from Norwegian and Swedish, which are more similar. And, my friends have said that, when you work with Danish people, sometimes you kind of have to lean in a bit when they're talking to sort of kind of get what they're saying. But basically, usually in a corporate situation, they'll be speaking their native language and we'll be speaking Swedish, and nobody pays any mind to it. It just, just sort of goes on like that. And I think that's really cool.
It's sort of interesting that the languages are, A, the languages are fairly close, and B, there's just such a tendency for people to understand all of them. It comes close to dialect at that point, right? It's like, where is the line drawn between a dialect, whereby, if I talk to someone from Australia or America or the north of England, for example, you're all speaking different dialects, but it's English, and so it's completely mutually intelligible. That's obviously a different thing, really. But then there's Scots spoken north of the border in Scotland, which is actually considered a separate language. And it is, I believe, taught in some schools. There's poetry written in it, books written in it, and there's a Wikipedia translation into Scots. But it is different, and it has its own rules which work a little bit differently to English. But similar enough that it's fairly intelligible. Like, I can read the Scots Wikipedia, for example, and understand it. A lot of the words I don't actually know. There are words in Scots which don't really exist in English, which often come from more sort of Northern European roots. But I can work out from the surrounding context and the words that I do know, what they're getting at. So that is almost a similar situation where, I think in that situation, if you were in a meeting where half the people are like extremely Scottish people speaking Scots, you wouldn't expect them to sort of switch to English necessarily,
right?
And they certainly wouldn't. So, but again, how much of a difference that is, it's difficult for me to appreciate how the delta between Swedish and Norwegian, for example, compares to the delta between English and Scots.
Yeah, and the whole term dialect is blurred so much by different languages because, for example, as you just said, technically, if a Swedish person can talk to a Norwegian person and they can talk back in Norwegian, and the Swedish person is speaking Swedish, and they can understand each other even though they're speaking different languages, technically you would think, well, that's closer to like a dialect. Just like, when I talk to an American person, we can kind of understand each other.
Kind of.
Most of the time. They're sort of, if they can understand each other like that, then technically, yes, as you said, maybe that's considered a dialect. But then when you look at Chinese, Chinese has loads of so-called dialects,
right?
But in the case of Chinese, they're not mutually intelligible. The written language, remains consistent between them, which is perhaps why it's possible to call them dialects. But they sound completely different. And when you have a Cantonese person talking in Cantonese to somebody from Shanghai talking in Shanghainese, they can't understand each other at all.
Right.
And yet they're called dialects. So I don't know.
I don't know what the sort of definition is or where the line is drawn. And I don't know for sure whether sort of in academic linguistic circles, those are considered dialects because they're called dialects in sort of common language, right?
Right.
We think of them as dialects, but maybe they're not, It may be that these days in academia that they're not considered to be dialects and they are more separate languages. I'm not sure. As you say, the written language is the same. So,
well, if you are a linguist listening to this, then please feel free to comment on our subreddit, Station 13.
Please do, if you haven't turned it off because you're frustrated with our completely being misinformed.
Or our incredible tendency to completely mess up geography. And anyway, so Danny, I happened to open up Facebook this evening, which is something I rarely do these days, and scroll down a little bit and chanced upon a post from yourself with some fairly controversial news, a fairly controversial announcement you made there. You want to just tell us about that?
I don't know if it's controversial, but so I am deactivating my Facebook account. Which is a thing that is distinct from deleting my Facebook account.
Right.
So there's a few things to sort of talk about and unpack there. But basically, I discovered yesterday that Facebook has the ability to deactivate your account, whereby, to all intents and purposes, it's like you've closed your account. You're not appearing on people's feeds. You can't post. You can't log in. But they keep hold of your data and the account is still kept around so that if you change your mind, you can actually reactivate it, right? And that's separate from deleting your account where they actually wipe all your data from the servers. And if you want it back, tough luck, you've deleted it, it's gone.
When you deactivate your account, I guess then you don't have access to Facebook Messenger?
I'm not sure about that. I actually think that you might. I think I read something about along those lines that you can still access Facebook Messenger with a deactivated account, which is a bit weird. I will probably delete the app in the spirit of things, because the thing is this. So I am deactivating my account as a first step towards potentially deleting it.
And I guess this begs the question: what prompted this?
Right. So, well, there's a few things. We talked before about Facebook's business model and about privacy and a lot of things sort of related to that. So I don't want to go into too much detail on all that. But there's obviously recently been the whole scandal with Cambridge Analytica. Have you been following that at all?
No, I haven't. What's going on there?
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's quite big news. Cambridge Analytica is a company that performs research on behalf of mostly conservative political organisations. So in the UK, it's for the sort of Conservative Party and UKIP and that and Brexit and all of that sort of side of things. Here in America, it's on behalf of Republicans and the Trump campaign.
Right.
They were a big part of the Trump campaign's sort of media strategy during the last election. And I haven't been following this story too closely, but the gist of it is that recently it's been revealed how much data they have on how many people and how they used this data in a manner that is distinct from what users thought they were going to do. So,
sorry, by they, do you mean Facebook or do you mean Cambridge?
No, I mean Cambridge Analytica.
Okay, right.
Cambridge Analytica essentially worked by creating a load of sort of fun quizzes on the internet that get shared around on Facebook, that you put in your thing and you answer a load of questions and it tells you which Harry Potter house you're in or whatever.
Right.
Of all varying, all varieties. And fairly predictably, they did this as a massive data mining organization rather than as a selfless contribution to people's desire to spend time doing quizzes.
Right.
And so they got a huge amount of data out of all these things. And they used that data to inform these political organizations and to push advertising to certain demographics for political purposes. A lot of video evidence has also come out of people from Cambridge Analytica talking to people representing various campaigns and so forth about the techniques they're using and how powerful they are and how it all works. And so this has been a big sort of controversy, which is controversial, but at the same time, it feels like it shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone. Like, we all kind of knew that our data was being mined in this way. And given the last year or 2 years, I guess, we've also knew that it was specifically being used for political purposes and not just for advertising. So it's not a big surprise, but it's just another reminder, right? Another time for it to come up in the news cycle.
Right.
And another opportunity, which I've mentioned before, for us all as individuals to look at our own usage of social media and Facebook and Twitter and these things, and to decide for ourselves what we want to do with them and whether we want to continue and how we want to go forward. And I feel like I should sort of get it on the record quickly that I don't actually necessarily have a problem with Facebook's business model per se. There are plenty of people on the internet who have said Facebook is an evil company and they don't care about anything but the bottom line, and they're selling people out and all this. And different companies have different priorities. It's clear that some tech companies care more about users' privacy than others. But there are people who work at Facebook, right? I know some people who work at Facebook and some people who used to work there, and the ones that I know have been good people. So I'm not saying that everyone who works at Facebook is evil, and I'm not saying that Facebook itself is necessarily evil, right? I actually think the service that it provides is valuable. I've said this before once when I think in a previous episode I said that I had thought of quitting many times but hadn't because the service it provides is too valuable to me. Mm. I appreciate being able to remain in contact with old friends and people who I've sort of fallen out of touch with, and we're not close friends, so I probably wouldn't make the effort to sort of write them an email and keep in touch regularly. But given that they post things and I sort of get it delivered into my newsfeed, that small connection remains. I like that. I think that's good. Mm. But I haven't been making much use of it recently. Mm. The last couple of years, much more of my time is spent on Twitter. Mm. I found that I prefer that as a platform. Twitter is naturally public-facing, and so everything that I post there is kind of intended for the public.
Right.
I don't post private photos or information about my relatives or where I've been living and things like that, which, I have posted on Facebook.
Right.
So I've shifted towards using Twitter and away from using Facebook. I rarely really look at Facebook these days. So I'm getting less of that benefit than I used to. Mm. And more of these stories are coming out. So for me, personally, the equation has shifted a little bit, and I'm starting to feel, okay, maybe for me, it's not worth it anymore. And maybe I should consider leaving it behind because my circumstances have changed and because Facebook has changed as well in the way that Facebook is being used, in the way that it's being exploited by companies like Cambridge Analytica. Mm. What they've done was not a hack. It wasn't a breach. They didn't break into their systems. They did what Facebook allows them to do, right? Mm. But Facebook imagined that when it was sending its users' data to people, that data would be used for advertising. And they evidently didn't imagine that it would be used for sort of underhand political manipulation purposes, which it seems to have been used for. So, there's a lot of blame to go around, and you can throw it all at Facebook if you like. I think there is a degree to which they just didn't expect this. Mm. Maybe they should have, maybe they shouldn't. But it's not really my problem. Like, all I can do is make a personal choice about whether it's right for me. And right now I feel like it's worth giving it a go, right? Because they've got this deactivation function, it's worth my while to try out deleting my account for a bit. And I can always change my mind if I decide to. Unless I actually, after a few weeks, I may decide I haven't missed this at all. I might as well just delete it. Mm-hmm. Because until I do that, of course, it's not actually worth much, right? I'm still leaving all my data on their servers, and they're still free to use it to send to advertisers and people. So I haven't actually achieved all that much by deactivating the account. This is mostly a personal explorative kind of thing, right? So I think if I really do want to I'm almost getting the worst of both worlds by doing this, right? Because I don't get access to the services of Facebook, but I don't get any of the advantages of not having my data on file. So I think one way or the other, I will have to commit in the end, either to reactivate my account or to delete it.
Right.
But I like the fact that I can sort of give it a trial run.
Hmm. Well, I support your decision. I would also love to do the same, to deactivate or delete my Facebook account, because I just don't really enjoy Facebook very much, to be honest.
Well, I mean, that's another part of it, is that I think for some people, again, this is all very personal, and so I'm not trying to push people to close their accounts or anything like that at all. Really, all I would encourage people to do, if I'm going to encourage them to do anything, is just to take some time to think about what they're doing and just decide, like, is this for me? Is it not? If it is, then great. If you're getting value out of it, then good. It's good that you're getting value out of a service. But it's just worth spending time, because there is a point where you feel like you have to engage with these things. I was reading an article recently where the younger generation these days, people who are sort of in their late teens, early 20s right now, who've grown up with all these services, Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and all that, there's much more of a feeling of like almost like a responsibility, like they have to like and comment on each other's posts. And if somebody posts, especially girls, if they upload a photo of themselves and within 5 minutes they don't have like hundreds of comments saying, "Oh, you're so beautiful, that looks amazing," sort of thing, then it's like a personal, it really affects them personally. And if they notice that a particular friend of theirs didn't comment, or their boyfriend didn't comment quickly enough or something like that, then it's like a personal slight against them, and actually representative of like people do choose to rescind their likes as part of feuds, right? I mean, this is all very sort of, this is maybe getting more towards the middle school sort of age, not the early 20s probably.
Right.
But like, you know, this is a way that people interact now, that, you know, there were different ways that people expressed their displeasure as teenagers before. This is not a new thing for teenagers to be mean to each other, right? But this is, you know, this is a very real thing now, that people feel duty bound to engage with these services.
I would count myself into that group as well. I like you, like I was just saying, I don't get any enjoyment out of it. I don't. Twitter, on the other hand, also like you, I find that I do get a lot of enjoyment out of it. I enjoy looking at my Twitter feed, and because I specifically limit my Twitter solely to industry colleagues. And so it's really useful. Right. You know, I'm actually reading stuff from all of my colleagues in the game development industry, and things that they're saying, and, you know, techniques, and new games and reviews of things, and also audio and engineering stuff. And it's fantastic. But Facebook, no, I just don't really enjoy it. And I feel though I'm obliged to use it because, especially now coming to Sweden, Facebook is major here. It's probably, you know, it is the social network in Sweden.
Right.
Twitter is around, obviously, but it's just not as popular. And so things like events, things like also the game industry in Sweden also makes more use of Facebook than it does Twitter. So, you know, my colleagues here in Sweden as well, the standard thing to do is to, you know, connect on Facebook and not so much Twitter here. So I kind of have to use it, because if I don't, then I'll be missing out on, you know, event invitations, or, you know, the kind of word from Swedish colleagues that I currently get from my colleagues in other countries on Twitter. That's all on Facebook. Right. So I kind of have to use it. So
right. And well, but you are getting value out of it, right? I mean, I felt similarly during my last year or two in Japan, where also in the area we were in, Kansai in Japan, a lot of events are organized through Facebook. And events are a tricky one. You know, there are now alternative sites and apps being made to try and deal with the events thing on its own, right? Like Eventbrite or Doorkeeper or things like that.
There's another one, meetup.com, which is used in Sweden a little bit too.
Right, meetup.com, yeah. So those exist, and those are reasonable alternatives. But if you are organizing an event and you decide to use that instead of Facebook, you're forcing everyone else to sign up to a new service.
Right.
And if those people have already got Facebook accounts, they probably feel like, I'd rather just use the account I've already got.
Right.
And B, if you're not organizing the event and the person who is using Facebook, then you're sort of putting yourself outside the group of people who are going to get that invitation.
Exactly.
You can still, I think, by default, access the event, unless they purposefully make it a private event. You can see the event and get all the information without being a member of Facebook. You can still browse the website for organizations and events, but you can't mark yourself as, you know, participating, for example.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's see how you go. I thoroughly support your decision. I think that probably because once you stop using it because your account is deactivated, I don't think you'll miss it, because if you're not using it anyway, and now the difference is now you can't use it, but you wouldn't have been using it anyway, even if you could use it. Probably the result will just be that you will have forgotten about it after a month. Oh yeah, that thing. I guess I should delete that now.
I expect so. I mean, I think a big part of the reason that my usage of Facebook has dropped a lot in the last year or two is that a couple of years ago, when the last big Facebook controversy happened, which is that they were continuing to track you and maintain the connection to Facebook even when you closed the Facebook app.
Right.
When that happened, I deleted the Facebook app, and I've only been using Safari to access Facebook since then. So I haven't actually had the Facebook app installed on my phone in a couple of years. And that already made a big difference, right? That reduced my engagement with it quite a lot. And so this is just kind of the next step in that direction.
Good luck.
See how it goes.
So this week is the annual Game Developers Conference in San Francisco.
It is indeed. I was fairly aware of this, given that I live quite close to San Francisco.
Right. Otherwise known as GDC. And how many times have you been to GDC?
I've only been twice.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I went once in 2011 in fact, I've only been to GDC once, which was in 2011 when I went as part of Vitae. Last year, I went up a couple of times when it was on to meet friends who were visiting, but I wasn't actually there for the conference. I just went in the evening.
Right. Yeah, I think I've been to GDC 4 times.
Wow.
And it's great. GDC is great.
GDC is great. I think it's the best conference, the best part of the year in the games industry. I know a lot of other people get excited about E3 and Tokyo Game Show and things like that, but GDC is the most interesting, I think.
Yeah, it's very inspiring too. You always come back from GDC feeling, sort of really ready to, get back into the trenches and, get some stuff done.
Definitely.
The one thing that I've always noticed going to GDC, it highlights for me one of the aspects that I really, really like about game development, and that is the sense of camaraderie and the sense of union and community amongst game developers. And it's quite unique. I think, I've only had experience in, language consulting and industrial design and graphic design before. So those are the only industries that I know. However, in my experience with those industries, for example, industrial design, it's highly secretive, which means it's sort of very, very competitive. And so when you meet other industrial designers, you don't really talk about your craft.
Right.
You don't really talk about what you're doing. Because all of that is very, very confidential, and you don't want anybody to get the upper hand on your company or what you're doing.
Right. Well, I mean, the games industry does have a bit of that nature to it as well, right? There's a difference. You've got to keep, until you announce it, you've got to keep it very secret. There's a lot of non-disclosure agreements whenever you go anywhere. If you just go to have an interview or say hello to a friend working in a company.
Yeah, of course, where publicity is concerned, of course, yes. But there is a difference, and it's very, very palpable when you go to GDC, because you get the sense that, if there's no case of rivals, if your company releases a really good game and your friend plays it, or your acquaintance plays it, they're going to be really happy because it's a really great game. And everybody's sort of just really there to enjoy games, which is obvious, of course, because it's the game industry. But,
right.
I think because a large proportion of people who get into game development simply start off as fans of games and players and consumers themselves, everybody has a common love of good games, basically. And so if people in other companies are making good games, then nobody is hesitant to acknowledge that, and that enthusiasm that you feel just for good quality games and games as a true art form. You really, really sense that at GDC, and everybody's kind of eager and open, and everybody's sharing what they've been doing, up to the boundaries of what confidentiality, especially with publicity, what that allows. But GDC itself, the conference, is full of really interesting lectures given by just, regular, average game developers, not necessarily all just celebrities in the field, but, some upcoming people as well will give you some very interesting talks with some great techniques and tools, and, of course, the artistic side. And within that, game audio is a massively enthusiastic, thriving little community inside the game community itself, because game audio it's like being the bass player in a band. There's rarely more than one of you in your team,
right?
And you don't really have anybody to talk to about what you do. And like being the bass player in the band, you're there and people appreciate you being there and doing what you do very well. But it's kind of like, oh yeah, good job with the music, Alex. That's it. It's not like you have somebody that you could sort of, get some, wow, this music's fantastic. I love what you did down there on the bottom end around 60 hertz. That peak right there was just perfect. Maybe you could think about, narrowing the Q band there to get more of a tighter focus. And,
right.
You don't really have a chance to talk to anybody else about that when you're in audio. So game audio people really love talking to each other and getting to know each other. And the tool of choice there is Twitter. So game audio GDC, I think it is just the hashtag. And when you're at GDC, you just post something there, and there'll always be somebody around you can meet up with or chat to, or Anyway, so GDC is wonderful, and I'm a little bit sad not to be there. I'm actually not there at the moment because my team is currently a few weeks away from having our game, hopefully Gold Master.
Oh, very exciting.
So right now is the absolute peak of busyness. Of course, never too busy for a casual chat with Danny over Station 13.
Of course.
But,
do you want to pitch your game? Do you want to put a link to it in the show notes or anything like that? It seems to make it worthwhile.
Next episode, yes. Not this one because it hasn't actually been officially announced yet. But
oh, I see.
The official announcement is at the start of April.
Okay.
And so, yes, that will be, I think, in about 2 weeks' time.
Oh, very exciting. Tune in next time for top secret Vito Backroom game.
Yeah, actually, I have another business trip coming up.
Oh, yeah?
That is to Boston. I'm going to be going to Boston in 2 weeks.
Oh.
2.5 weeks. Of course, we won't miss the Station 13 broadcast, of course, but I'm going to be heading over to Boston to an event, part of PAX.
Oh, exciting.
For the promotion of our game, so that's going to be exciting.
So you'll be showing it there, if anybody's going to be at PAX East.
Yeah, we'll be showing it at a demo of the game at an Oculus event called Game Days at PAX.
Oh, exciting. You're sort of letting the cat out the bag a little bit there, but...
Well, I mean, I think I might have mentioned already before that we're making an Oculus VR game, so that much is completely completely public, so that's fine.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Anyway, so GDC, it's great. Sad not to be there, but you're kind of there.
I'm close, but I don't think I'm going to make it up this year. I did actually get a message from a friend of the show and previous commenter, Cigar, who is around. And I'd like to meet him, but I just don't think I'm going to be able to make it up there this week, because I'm quite busy. So it's a shame. It's only on once a year, and it's so close. But San Francisco is just far enough away that it's kind of annoying to get to. Right.
Yeah. So, speaking of the game that we've been working on, so the last few weeks I've been really hard at the audio for the game, the music and the sound effects. I'm using my favorite two pieces of software for most of the production. One is Renoise, which is a tracker DAW, which we talked about before, which I have been using for all the music, which has been just great. I mean, it's just fits like a comfy old slipper right now. Everything is so quick and efficient for me in Renoise. Now, the other piece of software leads into our next topic, which I wanted to talk to you about, and that is Reaper. Now, Reaper is a DAW, horizontally scrolling traditional DAW, and I had mentioned it before, but the angle for today's discussion is a little bit different. So Reaper is the work of a developer called Justin Frankel. And Justin Frankel is the original creator of, do you know?
Nope.
Winamp.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, cool.
So,
Winamp. Remember that?
Yeah, so what do you think when you think Winamp?
I think it really kicks the llama's ass. That's what everyone thinks when they think Winamp.
Yeah.
And obviously the skinning. right?
Right.
The skinning was a big part of Winamp.
Yeah, so Reaper is Justin Frankel's DAW, and as I had mentioned before, it's an incredible piece of work. It's kind of like it's the Swiss Army knife of audio tools. It can do absolutely everything. It tends to divide people. People either really love it or they really hate it. And I'll talk about why people hate it in a moment. But they really love it because it's highly configurable. Basically, pretty much anything about the program can be changed. So if you don't like this keyboard shortcut, or if you want to make a custom workflow that does this very, very quickly, or if you find yourself doing certain actions, you can very, very easily create your own icons and toolbars and, set up macros and shortcuts. And basically, the program can bend and flex to whatever needs that are pressed on it. And it's fantastic for, post-production and sound effects creation and music, of course, recording, pretty much everything. So one of the... there's a few reasons why people don't like Reaper. People who don't like Reaper, the last reason is relevant to the discussion, but people don't like it because it has no workflow, because you have to decide one for yourself. So really, you just sit down in front of it. I think I might make some sound effects now. No, it's not really that easy with Reaper. You actually sort of, you need to have an established workflow, or you need to have an idea of how you're going to be working in order to get the most out of it. Otherwise, you just find yourself lost in, needless clicking and inefficient processes.
Right.
Once you do something enough, then you kind of work out, okay, well, in order to do that, I should do this, then this, then this. And that's when Reaper really becomes powerful, because you can set up everything so that it's very comfortable to do things exactly the way you want them. But if you're not, either you're not that familiar with it, you're just starting with it, or you just sort of want something that's more spontaneous that you can just sit in front of and just, slap down the ideas and see where you get, Reaper is not the right choice. So the second reason that people don't like it is the way that it looks. And this is really kind of ironic for a program that you can change absolutely everything about. You can skin Reaper very, very easily, and there are loads and loads of skins on the internet for Reaper in the true classic tradition of Justin Frankel software, like Winamp.
Right.
You can make it look like absolutely anything you want.
Oh yeah, look, I've tried, so to know what you were talking about, I tried to load up some screenshots of Reaper so I could decide for myself whether I liked the way it looked or not. And they're all different.
Right. Right.
They're totally different. I have no idea what the default skin looks like.
Right. So it can look like absolutely anything. And so the default skin is pretty ugly. And Justin's kind of idea there is that, well, it's almost like he wants to encourage the users to find their own workflow, find their own appearance, make this program into your own, and make it into what you want it to be, rather than me deciding how you should be using my software. You should decide how you want to use my software, and I'll make it able to accommodate any appearance or any workflow. So that's the basic philosophy behind the software. But it raises some interesting questions. One of those interesting questions is, what happens when you leave workflow up to a user to decide? And is the user going to be the best person to know what an efficient workflow is?
Right.
And that's a very fascinating question, because it also heads us into the direction of UX design, which is user experience design.
Yep.
Which really is a very, very new field of design, probably the last 10, 15 years, I guess, maybe a little bit shorter than that perhaps.
Yeah.
Where all of a sudden now, software doesn't just have to look good, but it has to be a good experience,
Right.
And
I mean, I think that's not all of a sudden, right? That's always been the desire of people who make software, but considering that as a distinct idea is a relatively new thing.
Right. So in the case of Reaper, the UX is ridiculously bad. I mean, it's horrible because there is no UX, because, you work that out yourself.
Right.
and you create your own UX, what it looks like, how it is to use, what functions you want where. You decide that for yourself. On the other hand, you take most other DAWs like Logic or Ableton Live or Pro Tools or, any of the other big, or Cubase, of course. And with those, they're much more traditional, where they have, a department of people whose job it is to figure out the UX of their software. So to a certain extent, those software will dictate to you how you should use them. Reaper is the work of, I think, 3 developers, and they don't have a UX department, and it shows. And it's almost analogous to open source software. Some open source software is awful when it comes to UX, fantastic when it comes to functionality. One that comes to mind is Inkscape. Have you ever used Inkscape?
Yes, a long time ago, though. I mean, the last time I used Inkscape was when it was still quite buggy. And, I mean, it was so lacking in features. I believe that these days it has come closer to being, a professional vector graphics tool. But back when I originally used it, it was, I think it was pre 1.0.
Right, okay.
And it was not very good.
Yeah. I'm a long-time user of Adobe Illustrator, and it's my my go-to tool for anything art-related. But interestingly, Inkscape often has features that come to Adobe Illustrator well before they ever come to, well before Adobe ever gets to them. So Inkscape is often on the bleeding edge of functionality, but the interface is very bad. And it's very difficult to use, and that's the reason why I guess it has failed to sort of gain the popularity compared to Adobe Illustrator. Of course, there's compatibility issues there too, because when you work in a design office, you have a whole bunch of legacy data that's in a certain format, and if you can't read that natively like Illustrator can, then it's inconvenient. But anyway, another example, of course, is Blender.
Right.
The 3D art package. So Blender as well has, now they have, I believe, because it is open source, but it's a rather unusual type of open source where there's a foundation that has been set up to actually manage the development of Blender.
I mean, it's very similar to Firefox in that respect.
Right.
In that, like Firefox or like Mozilla, there was a commercial product first. And, Netscape was a commercial browser that existed that eventually was not viable. So they released the source, and that grew into Mozilla and then Firefox.
Right.
And similarly, Blender, I think, has its origins in an actual commercial 3D modeling package. And then they made it open source after they'd already made something.
Yeah. So Blender, I believe now they have, professional UX people who have come in to help out with the workflow and the ease of use of the interface. But coming back to the question that I posed earlier, what do you think about users deciding user experience versus some designer kind of forcing his idea or her idea of a user experience on the user?
Yeah, I mean, actually, before that, I just want to throw in a link, just because your talk about UI versus UX reminded me of my favorite Tumblr account, which is UI UX analogy.
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
And there's a lot of classics on there. So I'll throw that in the show notes. I've just linked you to it as well. But in general, I tend to fall on the side of it's not the user's job to work out how they want to get that task done. So I tend to prefer more considered interfaces where the designer of the interface has determined what they think is the most effective way to achieve whatever you're trying to achieve, or determined some set of criteria by which to judge that, and then built their program around that. And that could take a number of forms. For example, Blender, which always had a reputation for having really bad UX and being very difficult to use. Even back in the day, before they took on UX designers and started trying to make it a bit easier to use, they did have a sort of governing principle. They weren't doing like what you describe Reaper as doing, which is giving you a sandbox to construct your own sort of 3D modeling engine. They had a particular way that the program was designed, and it was designed to be that by and large, you would always have one hand on the mouse and one hand on the keyboard. And that by mixing the commands and the use between shortcut keys on the keyboard and movements with the mouse, you could do things very efficiently. And that was the ideal behind Blender's user interface design. And a lot of people hated it, but the people who didn't hate it really liked it, right?
Right.
Because it did have a sort of logical base to it. It wasn't slapdash, and it wasn't a sort of a sandbox that the user had to create themselves. It didn't suit everyone, but for those that it did suit, it suited them quite well. I hope that the things they're doing now to make it easier to use don't sort of reverse some of those benefits that they had. Obviously, it'll be a compromise that they'll have to strike. But if they end up just looking like any other 3D modeling tool, then I guess the only advantage they've got at that point is that they're free. Maybe, arguably, that's the only advantage they've ever had. But, anyway, in that sense, I feel like it's similar to something like Vim as a text editor, right?
Right.
Where Vim has a very, very particular way that expects you to work, where it's modal. So by default, when you type, it doesn't put, like most text editors, when you press letters, those letters appear right. on the screen, and it's the next letters you type into your document. But the default mode that Vim is in is what's called command mode, where each letter on the keyboard actually does something, right? It performs some command.
Right.
And if you want to enter text, you press I, which is the insert command, which then puts you into insert mode, and then you can type text until you're done, and then you press escape to leave insert mode and return to command mode. Similarly to Blender, a lot of people hate that. And that is seen as unintuitive and difficult to use. But for those people who have learned to use it, they really like it because in command mode, every key can potentially execute some command. It can be incredibly efficient because you don't have to hold any modifier keys to do something, right? You can just press these individual keys to perform actions other than entering text extremely quickly.
Unlike a certain other legendary text editor.
Unlike Emacs, and I think Emacs is much closer to... you've tripped me into the text editors conversation. Emacs is much closer to the way you describe Reaper.
Right.
In that Emacs is almost infinitely customizable, right? The running joke about Vim and Emacs is that Vim is an excellent text editor if only it ran on a good OS, and Emacs is an excellent OS if only it had a good text editor.
Right. I thought the running joke was Emacs stands for Escape Meta Alt Control Shift.
Right. Yeah. But actually, there's a lot of jokes.
Right.
But with Emacs, you can do almost anything with it, right? It's extremely powerful.
Right.
And it is almost like an operating system in the affordances that it gives you. You can run a terminal inside Emacs and then run terminal programs inside that terminal window, right?
I believe that for a certain amount of time, Emacs is so configurable that actually you were using Emacs set up like Vim.
Right. Emacs has available for it a mode called Evil Mode.
Right.
Which is, I think, Emacs Vi layer or emulation Vi layer or something like that. But obviously, it's Evil Mode.
Right.
And that will bring over the modal nature and a lot of the keyboard shortcuts from Vim. Well, not keyboard short. I mean, they're so fundamental to Vim, you can't really call them shortcuts anymore, right? They're the fundamental commands, the whole way the thing works. And Evil Mode will bring over a lot of that. So in fact, that joke about Vim having a good, or Vi having a good OS and Emacs having a good text editor, both of those things have been resolved now because Vim runs on everything, and Emacs has evil mode. But the other thing is that the defaults in Emacs are universally acknowledged to be pretty bad, right? Even people who really like Emacs agree that Emacs, by default, the keyboard shortcuts that it comes with out of the box and the affordances that it gives you out of the box are not very good. And so a big part of learning to use Emacs is actually generating a configuration and finding the sort of appropriate set of plugins you want to use and creating out of it the text editor that fits you perfectly. And that's very similar to the way you describe Reaper working.
Yeah,
right?
It's exactly the same, really. And it's almost creatively stifling, almost. And I find that Reaper is fantastic to use when you're doing something that isn't necessarily that creative. And if you do need to do creative work in it, you really need to have an established workflow that you prefer yourself, and then you just sort of, mold Reaper around that workflow. Whereas Renoise, on the other end, is totally on the other end of the spectrum, much like Vim, where the workflow is so strict and that the way that you use it is so tightly dictated to you that there is no freedom for I don't really like having to do it this way. Well, you have no choice. You have to do it that way because that's the way the software works and that's the way it's been designed.
Right.
However, and this will be interesting to hear if this is the same with Vim, in Renoise, even though the workflow itself is very, very restrictive, the functionality is not, which means that you can find a way to do pretty much anything in Renoise, even though the way that you're doing it may not be the most efficient way to get to the result that you want, but you can pretty much do anything. You just have to adhere to its way of doing things. So that actual process of figuring out how to do something is actually a whole lot of fun.
Right.
So is that the same with Vim?
I mean, yes. Vim also has plugins which have sort of become increasingly powerful over time. For those not initiated in the world of programming text editors, I keep switching between using Vi and Vim as terms, but VI is the original text editor from the 60s, and Vim is short for Vi Improved, and it was a port of VI that was originally written for the Amiga, I think, or the Atari.
That's right.
And has grown to become the most commonly used version of Vim that there is. And part of the reason it's become so popular is because it developed this plugin interface, and people have written all sorts of amazing plugins that can do all sorts of amazing things. In that respect, it's moved a little bit closer to Emacs because you can customize it a bit more. But the most successful of those plugins embrace Vim for what it is. For example, a few years ago, I was programming a lot in a language called Clojure, which is a Lisp dialect. Well, back onto dialects. It's a language in the Lisp family of programming languages, and Lisp has historically been much better supported in Emacs than in Vim. Emacs, in fact, uses a dialect of Lisp called Emacs Lisp as its scripting language. So all the Emacs plugins are written in Lisp, and it was developed at a time when Lisp was very popular. And a part of the thing that's very good about the way Emacs works is that it's very easy to sort of run a live Lisp session inside the Emacs text editor. And so you can write a line of Lisp code and then press, I think it's Control and E or Control X, and it will execute that line in this sort of ambient Lisp environment that is running. And so you can have this very dynamic way of programming where you're sort of exploring the problem, right? You're actually writing and running and executing the code all at the same time. And a lot of the early Clojure plugins for Vim attempted to replicate this experience by having a frame within the text editor, which is like what's called a REPL, like a command line interface where you type in a Lisp command and then you press enter and it executes it and gives you the answer, and you can type in another command. And it just didn't work very well because Vim doesn't really work like that. Emacs does much better with these sort of command line interfaces in panes. So, and then a guy called Tim Pope, who is very famous in the Vim community and has written countless plugins. He started using Clojure, and he decided to write a plugin for it. And it's called Fireplace. I'll put a link in the show notes. But his plugin worked differently to all the other plugins at the time because it really was written with an understanding of the way that Vim works. And Vim already has a sort of way that you input commands to Vim, which is to press colon. You can, if you're in command mode, wherever you are on the screen, it doesn't matter. You can just press colon and it'll move you to the very bottom line where you've got a command line that you can enter a Vim command, and then you press enter and you get the response to that command or the Vim action happens or whatever, right? So he just extended that so that you could enter Lisp commands down there, and then the result would appear down there, just like it would with the Vim command. And it just felt so much more native to the way that Vim works. So that's kind of an example of where you can customize it. You can change the behavior and add behavior that doesn't sort of natively exist. But that customization goes much better and feels much more natural to use if you do it with an understanding of the sort of philosophy behind Vim's design. And you embrace that and you make it work and fit with the rest of the Vim. Another example is Fugitive, which is the Git plugin for Vim. And there's a Git plugin for Emacs called Magit or Magit. I don't know how you pronounce it. It's like magic, but with a T instead of a C. And those are both very highly thought of, very well-respected plugins. But the Emacs Magit one works in one way, and the Fugitive for Vim is extremely different. And they both work in ways that are sort of built towards the philosophy of the respective environments.
I guess the reason that you still use Vim over all of the other options that are out there for programmers, has that anything to do with just being very, very comfortable with this restrictive workflow that it has?
Well, I mean, to me, all the others feel restrictive.
Interesting.
I mean, it is partly, I think it is in large part a sense of sort of comfort and muscle memory, because I've been using Vim for, 14 years now. And so it really is under my, like, I don't think about it all that much, right? The way that I think about editing text is, I think, informed by what Vim makes it easy to do. So, for example, Vim has shortcuts to change everything between the current pair of brackets or the current pair of braces, for example.
Right.
And so I tend to almost see the text that makes up a program in these sort of chunks. And I can see what would be very easy and quick to, if my cursor is currently located here, I can very quickly change this thing in the way that I want with these shortcuts. Whereas I think if you're used to a more sort of visual style, you're not dividing them into kind of logical, almost semantic chunks like that, but you're just looking at their location on the screen and saying, well, I'm just going to drag from here to here and delete this text and write this other text.
Right.
So, and other things like Vim makes it very easy to repeat a command. Right. So just pressing dot, the full stop or period key, will repeat whatever the last command is. And so if I have a repetitive change that I want to make throughout a file, I may want to do 2 or 3 things in many places in the file, right? And I think if you weren't using a sort of Vim-like environment where repeating a command is really easy, you'd do those 2 or 3 things up here, and then you'd scroll down and do the same 2 or 3 things over here, and so forth. But because Vim makes it very easy to repeat a single command, I tend to do the first change all the way through the file, and then the second change all the way through, and then the third change all the way through. Because that's just a bit quicker, right? And I think that's sort of the same thing we were talking about with language earlier, right? The way that I think has slightly been molded by the interface that I'm used to working with. In fact, I'm sure it's similar to you, having used a tracker for your whole career, which is very different to the way that most people interact with music, right?
Right. Yeah, it's exactly the same. You tend to think about it in a slightly different kind of way just because you're so used to using a program with a kind of restrictive workflow that has forced you to get used to doing it in this way. And then eventually, after doing that enough that way, you attain a similar level of, musical awareness that people using any other DAW would have. But you just come at it from a different direction because you're achieving it in a different way through the kind of unusual functionality of this different style of program.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that jumped out to me, I haven't spent an awful lot of time with Tracker software. I really want to. I kind of want to learn how to use it properly, and I've got Renoise installed here because I'd like to get into it, but I haven't had time. But one thing that struck me very early on that made me think, I felt like I was much more conscious of the structure of the music that I was writing with Renoise. Because in particular, one thing in particular really sort of resulted in this, which was the fact that you can set a default step
right
in Renoise. And then if you press a key, like a musical key, right, a note, it will enter that note. And by default, the cursor will jump by that amount forward.
Right.
And so if you want to sort of have a rhythm where, like, on every fourth step or whatever, it's going to play a C, for example, you can just hold down the C and it will just go down through the whole sort of pattern, filling that in at this regular interval, right?
Right.
And I felt like again, I don't really know what I'm talking about because I've only used this for 5 minutes, but it really felt to me like that encourages you to think about the kind of structure of the way that your music is formed out of patterns rather than being this, I don't know, with the piano roll interface, I've kind of felt like I'm going through it. It's a similar sort of thing to what I described with doing the changes interleaved versus doing one change all the way through the file and then another change, right? It's like I'm just drawing the music out linearly from start to finish with a piano roll interface. Whereas with the Tracker, I felt like I was much more thinking about how is this actually structured and how do these things play together?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that Reaper has, one danger that Reaper has, which is potentially similar to Emacs and probably similar to Vim to a certain extent too, is the temptation to tinker.
Oh yeah,
and fiddle and basically, because Reaper everything is so customizable. When you fall into a sort of creative rut where you just sort of don't really have any ideas at that particular moment, it's so tempting to just sort of, well, maybe it's not working out because this is inefficient and I need to find a way to make Reaper more efficient for this specific thing that I'm doing.
Yes.
And then I don't really like what these sliders look like anymore. So you go onto the, Reaper's skinning website and start scrolling through all the countless skins that are available for it. And then you start trying them out. And then you sort of think, oh, well, I like this theme, but that's the wrong color there. And this is, so maybe I can go in and just change the theme myself. And, it's just, before you know it, you've sort of wasted a good, valuable 30 minutes to an hour just basically tinkering.
Wasted? Is it really wasted? I've lost days to procrastinating with my Vim setup. But, some people have Sudoku, some people have the newspaper crossword. That's not original. I've got a friend who uses Emacs, and he uses a really old version of Emacs. And so none of the plugins work, right? So whenever he wants to use a new plugin, he has to download the source code to that plugin and go through the source code, like figuring out how he would have to change it to make it work with this old version of Emacs. And that was exactly how he described it. He's like, well, it's my equivalent of Sudoku. Like, it's just a way that I sort of, a mild little exercise for the brain that I can use to pass the time.
Right. Yeah. That's one thing. Renoise can be grouped together with Ableton Live is another very popular DAW. Ableton Live also has very, very little that you can customize about it, and that's one of the reasons that many people don't like it. And it really forces you into workflow. And Renoise is similar in that regard. Mind you, Renoise actually can be scripted with Lua.
Right. Can you script like the program, or is it more like you can create scripted effects?
You can create scripted effects and actions, so you can make the program do things with LuaScript.
Oh, okay.
And you can
like
create
macros.
Yeah, but you can also create interfaces.
Oh, right.
So that sort of pop-up interfaces to perform certain tasks. And there's a big repository of tools that people have written for Renoise. For example, this particular one, you pull it up and it will give you like this little pop-up modal which allows you to sort your patterns by a certain kind of criteria or, things like that. So, yeah, it can actually be scripted like that.
Well, that's pretty powerful. That was one of the things I always really liked about Blender, actually. If you hover on any button or part of the interface in Blender, a tooltip comes up, and not only does it describe what the button does, but it also gives you the Python function that you would call to achieve what that button does. Essentially gives you the Python function that button calls. So if you're writing a script for Blender and you think, okay, and you sort of know how to use Blender, and you're thinking, well, basically I want it to do this and this and this, you can literally point at the buttons that you think you'd like it to do and copy out the functions that it tells you.
That's great. So I think we're kind of, I'm not sure how we summarize this, whether we are saying that UX is best left to some professionals to decide for us, or whether UX is something that we should have the ease and ability to decide for ourselves. Probably, I guess, the former.
I think both, and it depends. And,
good answer.
And people will decide. Because, Vim is very opinionated, but it's also quite customizable.
Right.
Emacs is extremely customizable. I think the thing that these programs have in common is not that the designer has decided for you or that it's totally customizable by the user. The axis for me is, does it have a central philosophy, a central way that it's supposed to work, right? An idea around which is built.
I see.
And I think that Vim and Emacs both do, and that Renoise does. I don't know about Reaper enough to know whether it does. But I think just giving the user a complete sandbox with which they can create their own thing is perhaps, at least doesn't interest me, because I want to be given some guidance of how to use it. But to what extent you sort of allow them to customize it not at all, or to customize it quite a lot, but still around this central idea, depends.
If that philosophy includes the idea that this program should be an open sandbox that the user can create their own UX in, if that is the philosophy, then definitely Reaper can fall into that group,
right?
Because but it's kind of
okay, maybe this is a cop-out answer, but I think that is a fair enough philosophy. That's quite a similar philosophy to Emacs, I suppose.
Right.
In that Emacs is sort of an environment with a text editor in it, almost.
Right.
And yeah, I think that's a completely valid philosophy, and one that probably doesn't appeal to all that much to me personally. So I tend towards Vim over Emacs, and I would probably tend towards something a bit more structured over Reaper. But I completely respect people who decide to use Emacs. That is a valid choice in this world.